Happy July 4th, and thank you for joining me.
I am Dr. Annette Farovich with Healthy Mind, Body, Spirit, and you can find me on the internet at www.healthymindbodyspirit.net. You can also find me on my YouTube channel. Just search for Dr. Annette Farovich. You will see here that I am recording outside, and so you will see some of my background change and some of the sun change. But here's where I love to record, on my deck in the Detroit metropolitan area. And if you like these videos, be sure to like my videos on YouTube and also please subscribe to my videos.
Today, we're going to be talking about what is love and what are the differences between love today and love, let's say, about 30 or 40 years ago. Now, remember that you can always join me live on Sundays, but because it's July 4th, I'm pre-recording this for you, but you will see it live on Sunday at 4 o'clock for the premiere of this episode number 3.
In my series, I typically define the concept in around 3 of my video. If you look at my series on self-esteem, for example, I defined what is self-esteem in episode number 3. And that's what I'm going to do for you today. In episode number 3, we're going to take a look at the definition of what is love. Now, we talked a little bit about some of the definition in episode 2 when we were talking about love and attachment. And we talked a little bit about the differences between, for example, a brotherly love, which is also known as philos love in Greek terminology. We talked a little bit about brotherly love, and we compared that to, for example, eros love. And eros love is the Greek term for intimate love, passionate love, or sexual love. We also talked especially about motherly love in our last episode on love and attachment for this series. And when we talked about that, we talked about in particular the love between a mother and a child, and the child and a mother. According to Greek terminology, storge love is a motherly love or a dependent love. Now, when we think about that, this kind of brings up an interesting point about how, depending on our perspectives and our cultures, it's going to make a difference in the way that we understand, for example, a dependent kind of love. From a Western culture, we see that the dependency typically is in the child upon the mother. But actually, in Japanese cultures, when they take a look at this motherly love, the dependency goes in both ways. That love shows a dependency for the child and the mother, but also the mother and the child, and that relationship is a very intricate kind of relationship where both is dependent on one another. It's one of the reasons why you see in Japanese culture a much greater respect for elderly individuals, because the dependency just isn't on the child and the mother, but also the mother and the child. Two other types of love that I'd like to talk about to help us better define what is love is also a love that's called, from the Greeks, pragma love. Pragma love is a practical love based on duty. We might see this, for example, when we see older men in different cultures who marry younger women, or when we see in other cultures where we have arranged marriages. These are marriages then that demonstrate a relationship that's based more on practical love and based more in duty, for example. And then finally, the last type of love from Greek theory and philosophy would be agape kind of love. An agape kind of love, we would know this as an unselfish or unconditional type of love. Now, I have a couple examples of that. When we think of agape kind of love, very often it is also defined as a godly love, an unselfish, unconditional kind of godly love. Now, it's easy for me to understand this agape kind of love when you explain it from a godly kind of love intellectually.
More so, however, I have learned to understand agape love from a motherly perspective. I understand from a religious perspective or Judeo-Christian perspective how uh, God is supposed to feel about me, right? So that God is supposed to accept me unconditionally, no matter what I do. But I understood that more from a belief perspective, a heart belief perspective, after I had my two boys. And then I understood really what unconditional love means. Okay, so that just kind of gives you some idea of some of the definitions that are out there for love that we can examine from a philosophical perspective. We can examine those from a theological perspective.
But as we know, there are many types of love. And even when we take a look at those, we don't always in the Western world take a look at all of those types of love scientifically.
Here in Western culture, we tend to not take a look at philosophical positions on love or theological positions on love. We typically look at love from a scientific perspective. And now this is kind of interesting because very often throughout science, we've avoided the question of love. And the reason why is because it's very hard to study. It seems to be very unscientific. However, if I were to ask you to tell me an important story that you have about an important event that occurred in your life, likely you would tell me a story that involved love, someone you loved, someone you cared about. Yet in this Western culture, like I said, we have avoided studying love. So, some of the things that we talk about scientifically about love are going to give us some really interesting perspectives on what love really is, but some of it is actually going to fall short of what may seem to be really satisfying about what we know about love. When we take a look at love from a scientific perspective, what we typically like to do is take a look at it from across different kinds of disciplines. And so, for example, what we just looked at is we took a look at some definitions from Greek philosophy on love. They have studied love in a more philosophical kind of way, and so we take a look at the different kinds of definitions more from a philosophical perspective. As scientists, we also want to study love from a biological perspective. And so we see that we have love and attachment, as we talked about in episode number 2, as part of our DNA, that there is a biological basis for our love. Now, one of the things that I didn't talk about relative to love and attachment was some of the evidence that we see that love and attachment has both a biological and an environmental basis. So, for example, when we take a look at the relationship between a mother and a child and attachment, where do we see a biological predisposition to attach? We see those in the behaviors of both mother and child. These behaviors can include from a mother, for example, the way that a mother talks to a child using this high-pitched voice like this. And we talk about their cute little toes. And notice that not only is my voice high-pitched, but it is also soft. And what we know is that infants are attracted to soft, high-pitched voices. It's one of the reasons why scientists suggest that infants attach to their mother more readily than their father. Their father has a low-pitched voice, right? And strong, domineering voices. This startles infants very often. And it's the voice that's high that they are predisposed to attach to. Other behaviors that mothers very intuitively or instinctively engage in when mothers are not distracted and when they are fully engaged in their children. Remember, this is when attachment has to occur. Where's the mother's face? Typically, when a mother is fully engaged in their infant, their faces are 6 to 8 inches from their infants. And where is it that an infant can see best? An infant can see best 6 to 8 inches from their face. Where is a mother's face? Typically 6 to 8 inches. Now, did anyone tell the mother or teach the mother that that's where they need to place their face in order to develop the best attachment with their infant? Of course not. What we're saying is that we are biologically predisposed to engage in these attachment style behaviors. How about the infant? How might the infant be biologically predisposed to attach to the mother? Well, for the infant, what the infant does is engages in, for example, cooing behaviors and babbling behaviors. And what does the mother want to do when the infant engages in these behaviors? The mother wants to also engage in talk, right? And babbling and cooing with the infant. So, this kind of predisposition on both the mother's side and on the infant, on behalf of the infant, allows this kind of interaction to take place, which then motivates attachment. Another thing that I loved with my boys that I discovered as a mother that helped me attach to my boys was behaviors that are called rooting behaviors. Rooting behaviors. And these rooting behaviors are an infant who is actually smelling the mother's milk when the mother is holding the infant close to her. The infant begins to smell the mother's milk, and what ends up happening is the infant nuzzles in and roots down to look for the milk, right? But in the process, what ends up happening? The infant ends up nuzzling with the mother, and this is a wonderful reward for holding your infant close. It was the most rewarding behavior. The ones that I love the most from my infant was the rooting behavior. I knew that they weren't trying to attach to me. I knew that they weren't just nuzzling up with their mother. I knew that they were looking for my milk. Nevertheless, it made me want to cuddle with that infant and hold that infant very close. So again, you can see that there's a biological predisposition for us to attach. And also, we also need an environmental component, a willingness to engage, a willingness to be close to our infants without being distracted. I wanted to say also, because I talked a lot about the distractions of the mother in my last episode and not distractions of the father. Very often what we find with fathers is that fathers can be wrapped up in doing things, in activities. Remember what we said, fathers like physical activities more so than mothers do. And so they may end up getting distracted by their work, by making sure that they are busy around the home or outside, or even with their own interests. So this helps us better understand a scientific approach to how we define love. So we talked about historically what are some definitions of love that we looked at. Now we're taking a look at some biological predispositions. I gave you some practical information about some biological predispositions, and now I want to talk to you a little bit about the chemistry that predisposes us to our infants. What is the biochemical basis for love? Well, there are several hormones and several neurotransmitters that are related to love. Neurotransmitters are similar to hormones, but they are chemical reactions in the brain, and hormones are chemical reactions in the bloodstream. All right, so one of the main biological chemicals that is associated with love is oxytocin. Oxytocin is both a neurotransmitter and a hormone, so it activates in our brain as well as in our bloodstream. Oxytocin is known as the love drug, and it's known as the love drug because it attaches us to one another. We used to also think that this was only a female hormone, and we found out differently. The reason why we used to think that it was only a female hormone is because oxytocin is released during breastfeeding. And this also demonstrates a biological basis for attachment. So when women breastfeed, they release oxytocin, both as a neurotransmitter and as a hormone. However, we also see that we release oxytocin during sexual intercourse. When we have an orgasm, we release oxytocin. And so, remember, this can be a great reason why we attach to people who may not be good for us, because during the attachment process, during sex, we end up releasing oxytocin. In this release of oxytocin, then we attach. So if you think that you can go and have casual sex with an individual and leave it at that, remember that the biology of both your mind and your bloodstream tell you differently. The next neurotransmitter that I wanted to talk about that is a biochemical reaction to love is dopamine. Dopamine is a very interesting reward chemical. So dopamine actually acts in the brain in the exact same way that cocaine acts upon the brain. And here what we have is we have two actual activating components of dopamine. One of them is part of the reward that we get for engaging in that behavior, okay? So dopamine is released as a reward for engaging in behavior. We also know that dopamine is released in anticipation of a reward. And this now is a wonderful chemical that's going on in our bodies that not only help us attach to a loved one, but actually it helps us attach to specific behaviors and also specific goals. So, for example, when we are anticipating a date with somebody, for example, that we had really great passion for, or great interest in, let's say, okay? So we're getting ready for our first date. So there's the anticipation that you feel, like the butterflies in your stomach, that you feel, that's dopamine. That gets us excited for that date, right? Also, we see dopamine is released then when we are enjoying ourselves on the date. Okay, this is very interesting because it's the difference between dopamine 1 and dopamine 2. Dopamine 2 is actually released first in anticipation of an event and also after the event for pair bonding. Again, what are we saying when we are trying to define what is love? Well, the first thing that we do as scientists, it may not feel very fulfilling to you right now, but the very first thing that we do as scientists is we make observations about where and when love exists. Okay, I want to talk about one more biochemical reaction that we have that demonstrates that love is part of our biological system. And that is where we see increases in the orbital frontal cortex of the brain. Now, the orbital frontal cortex of the brain is, first of all, whenever we're talking about anything that has to do with the front area of the brain here, what we're talking about is powers of thinking and decision making that occur mostly here in the prefrontal cortex. The orbital frontal cortex is the region right behind the eyes. So it does affect thinking areas of the brain, but it also affects feeling areas of the brain. And feeling areas of the brain are actually in the center of your brain. The orbital frontal cortex is connecting that thinking area of my brain along with my feeling area of my brain. And we talk a lot about this in psychology because that is really key to where our biological reactions occur, where you're talking about primitive reactions. We call that the reptilian brain. And the reptilian brain is really at the at the top of our spinal cord there and at the base of our brain. So where we get very reactive types of behaviors, right? Instinctual kinds of behaviors. As our brain has evolved, we see then that higher order mammals, for example, have emotions. A lizard or a bird is different than my dog, for example, emotionally speaking, right? And then when you talk about human beings, we have the prefrontal cortex that we've added, and now of course, we are still capable of using our lower order brains, right? Our emotional brains and our instinctual brains. We, of course, are still capable of using those. And it really is the interaction of those areas of our brain that we can talk about all kinds of philosophical things, like that's what makes us human, that's what gives us free choice. That's what moves us from unconscious behaviors to conscious behaviors. That's what moves us from immoral behaviors or strictly biological behaviors and moral behaviors, right? So there's all kinds of philosophical things that we can talk about. And because we're talking about love, we kind of want to consider some of those philosophical arguments. Now, remember, what I'm presenting to you here is really a scientific approach to love. Sometimes this can feel unfulfilling for you because Western science has dismissed the concept of love and studying love for a long time. Even now, you can see that we know a lot about the biological basis for what we term to be love, but as we move along, we really don't know a lot of the philosophical or even theological basis for things like love that we really should, as human beings, probably want to discover and know. Now, I want to get down to looking a little bit more at how science has defined love. And again, this might feel a little bit dry. It might feel a little unfulfilling for you. But let's take a look at how scientists have looked at love. Now, the theory of love that we really take a look at and still is studied even in 2021 is a theory that was really started by Robert Sternberg, and he is a cognitive psychologist because Robert Sternberg has written a book that's called The Nature of Cognition and therefore is highly respected in the field of science and psychology. So he's really helped us give a scientific look at love. But let's take a look at what he determined and how he defined love to show you what it actually may be missing from a philosophical or even theological understanding of what love is. Sternberg's triangular theory of love. Components to this triangular theory of love, and these three components, when combined, give us what he called consummate love. And consummate love is what Sternberg considered to be real love. And this real love is a combination of these three components. I'm going to talk about all three of these components, and we're going to talk about what happens when they interact with one another, and we're also going to talk about them at first simply by themselves. All right, what does it mean when we define this component by itself? So the very first component is intimacy. Intimacy. Now, intimacy alone by itself just means that I like you. This is according to Sternberg's triangular theory of love. And remember, as scientists, we want to put parameters on things to help us understand it so that we can measure it better, right? We need to measure things to determine whether or not they actually exist, right? In the same ways that we biased ourselves to think that they exist, okay? All right, so intimacy. Intimacy, according to Sternberg's theory, is liking. If I only have intimacy, then what happens? I like you is what I do. All right? He also talked about a second component, and the second component is passion. And passion is infatuation. This is the idea that I can be swept off of my feet in a sexual kind of way is what this is. So infatuation, this is, according to Sternberg, passion, also described as passion. Okay, and the last component of love, according to Sternberg, is commitment. So, here, to give you an example, we can have commitment without either intimacy or passion, right? This is the idea that we will stay with a person or we will remain loyal to that person, like as if we might remain loyal to our employer and stay with them for a long time, right? It is considered empty love because it lacks either liking or passion. All right? Now, when we combine those different types of love, we also get a more complex definition of love according to Sternberg. So, for example, when we combine commitment with intimacy, so this is a commitment with liking, what we end up having is what Sternberg referred to as companionate love. Companionate love. And so this is, I do like you, and I am willing to be committed to you, but I don't feel passionate about you. Okay? So we might see this kind of commitment or this type of love when we see dependent love, or according to Greek philosophers, pragma love, practical kind of love. Yes, I like you. I enjoy being with you, but I really don't want to have a sexual relationship with you. I'm not passionate about you, but I also will commit to you as well. All right, so companionate love. And we often see this again in other cultures where you have arranged marriages. Often you won't see arranged marriages with somebody who's just willing to commit. They also have to have an intimacy, or in this definition, a liking for the other person for that to work. Okay, and then we can also have commitment and passion. This is called fatuous love. Fatuous love. This is the kind of love where you see somebody propose to somebody else after a month of knowing them, right? Or a couple months or a couple weeks of knowing them. They feel great passion for that person, and that must mean that we are soulmates, right? We're soulmates. This is where we get the idea of a romantic love or soulmate type of love. That is a fatuous love. And therefore, because we must be soulmates, I've never felt this way about anyone else before. Therefore, let's get married. And so, right? Then the final combination that we want to look at is intimacy and passion. And what Sternberg called this was romantic love. You might know it more as hooking up, right? Hooking up, or maybe even a booty call. Okay, what is this? I like you and I feel very passionate about you. However, I don't want to make a commitment to you. All right? So we see that a lot. And again, when we combine those three things, intimacy, passion, and commitment, we have what Sternberg calls consummate love, and that's what he considers or defines to be real, full love. So that's one definition of love that we've been using for a long time in the scientific community for probably over 40 years. And I still teach it in my classes. He also wrote a survey which is called What is Your Love Story? And that might be an interesting survey for you to take to see basically a very general kind of look at how you might define your different types of love. You'll notice probably all over the internet that there are different ways to categorize yourself in using different personality tests or different love tests or different self-esteem tests. And the only thing I want to say about these is sometimes they're fun and sometimes they're great to look at. One of the things that you want to do is you want to take a look at who's the author of that survey to see whether or not it's a valid survey. I do talk about that in What is Self-Esteem, a little bit more about whether or not surveys are valid and reliable. One of the issues, though, that I have with using these personality surveys or any of these surveys really to put you in categories is that we begin then to change our perspective on who we are in order to fit certain categories. I find this with individuals who are diagnosed with ADHD, and then they begin to see their lives as being impulsive and an inability to be able to think clearly or to be scattered. And this often I see with my students, and it's often not true. I see the behaviors ensue after a diagnosis. We're going to talk a little bit more about this as we go along because we really want to be careful who's diagnosing us. But as you can see, many of these definitions of love or our understanding of love, it becomes interesting to a certain extent, but really very incomplete. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more then about the hierarchy that I talked about before that we want to talk about regarding love. And so we said in our very first episode on love, what is real love? We talked a little bit about the hierarchy, starting with the idea that God is love. Now, remember, I said I'm not exactly sure 100% exactly what that means, and I've been brought up as a Christian, so but still, it's hard for us to wrap our brain around that because many of us have many questions about godly love relative to, right, a lot of suffering and pain in the world. So we have a lot of questions about that, so we're going to kind of leave that alone. But then we also talked about the hierarchy of love, and we talked a little bit about marriage, and we talked about a hierarchy in the family. And now we're talking about what is love. Now, most of us likely say, well, I likely can't love somebody else unless I love myself. So we want to kind of maybe examine that. Is there truth in that statement? Okay. If we looked at a Judeo-Christian perspective, we might say that, well, what we understand about love is not only that God is love, but that we are supposed to love God above all else and love our brother as well. Love one another, right? Okay, well, that's another perspective of love. I would like to take a look at what we have as evidence for what might actually be healthy love, right? That and inspire us to love in healthy ways. And when I say that, when I say what is that loving in healthy ways? When I'm saying that, I literally do mean equates to good health, right? And that is good mental health, that's good physical health, and that's good spiritual health. So, what kind of love do we have, or what examples of love do we have that really inspire us to be better? We are all humans, and so sometimes it might be difficult to see any one unit or any one definition fit all of our experiences of what love really is. But again, if we use health as a definition for good love, then we kind of can narrow in a little bit on what that means. So we know that individuals who are happiest, most satisfied with their lives, are individuals who have other people to depend on. One of our greatest needs is the need for other people. And not only one other person, but usually a small unit. We also know that individuals who are married and have children are also happier. Although we see decreases in satisfaction in marriage with children. Now, so this makes the whole pot of tea pretty messy, and in doing so, what we see is that there's a lot of scientists that don't want to deal with the topic of love. Now, what I want to show you is I want to share with you theory as far as health and wellness goes that is actually one of my favorite theories. And this theory is a theory that was proposed by Erikson. And this theory is a theory on psychosocial development. And so Erikson's theory built on Freudian theory. But Freudian theory was actually a biological theory. It's a biological theory suggesting most of who we are is due to a biological maturation that takes place through stages. And these stages begin in infancy from 0 age and goes all the way up through death. And what we see in these stages, Erikson's stages, is we see different components that demonstrate the outcomes of healthy developing relationships and unhealthy developing relationships. And as you can see, this psychosocial theory considers both environmental perspectives as well as biological perspectives, and they demonstrate a very keen interaction at many different stages of this theory. Now, as you can see from the chart, there are many components of this theory. The first one represents a conflict. So each one of those steps represent a stage, and at each one of those stages, they represent a conflict. And this conflict can have a good outcome or an adaptive outcome, or what we call a negative outcome or a maladaptive outcome. Also, at each one of the stages, we see an optimum age range for completing that stage. Also, at each stage is a critical relationship. And this relationship then, if it leads in adaptive tendencies, what that relationship will do then is result in the last element of Erikson's theory, which is a virtue. Okay, so let's take a look at each stage of the development. The very first stage is trust versus mistrust. And the optimal age range here is 0 to 1. And the significant relationship or critical relationship is with the mother. And if the interaction with the mother is positive, then what that infant does is develops a feeling of trust that that mother will respond to that infant's needs. And so what the infant ends up doing then is gaining a virtue of hope. And what that hope is the belief that our needs will be met throughout life. If the mother is not responsive to the infant's needs, then that will result in a maladaptive feelings of mistrust throughout life. The second stage that Erikson proposed is autonomy versus shame and doubt. And this stage typically occurs when the child is between 1 and 3 years of age. And you can think about those events that are going on in the child's life during that age range. Like, for example, the terrible twos, right? So a child is what during that time? Is becoming curious of his or her world, and in their curiosity then, are they being punished for their natural curiosity, or are they learning that this natural curiosity is part of their independence or autonomy, learning to determine what is a good choice or what is a bad choice, and who is a significant relationship with at this point in their lives, or the critical relationship with their parents, because their parents are teaching them what are good choices and what are not good choices to make. And that is then allowing them to move in a direction of learning, curiosity, and the beginnings of independence for that child. In the third stage of development, children are learning to take more initiative. Now, if we take a look at all the elements, we can see a little bit how this stage is different than the prior stage. In the prior stage, children were learning to become more independent in their choices. In this stage now, the virtue here is morals. And so, working with all of these elements, we can see that during the ages of 3 to 6, what children are doing is they are learning, are they a good girl or are they a bad girl? Are they a good boy or are they a bad boy? And they are learning this through their entire family. And so now we begin to see how important and critical the family interactions are for understanding the basis of love. The basis in particular of unconditional love is what they're learning, right? Will you still love me even if I make a poor choice? Will you determine that I am a bad girl, right, or a good girl based on my choices? And so here again is where we get the structure of a loving family. And now, still part of our childhood, let's take a look at the last stage that develops our foundation and our direction. This stage is called industry versus inferiority. And this stage occurs at ages 6 through 12. And what we're doing here at this stage is now we've entered school. So let's take a look at this stage compared to the last stage, where really we hadn't entered school yet. And so our morals were being guided by our family. Now, as we enter school age, we are beginning to determine our personality based on people outside of our family. And this is now when we begin to see, for example, whether or not we are considered to be one of the smart ones, or whether or not we are considered to be an athlete, or whether or not we're considered to be a nerd, or whether or not we're considered to be a partier, right? So, how do we end up determining those kinds of things about ourselves has to do with our opportunity now to compare ourselves to others. So now that we are seeing other people who are our same age, who are our peers, we begin to see whether or not we are developing competence in each one of those areas. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next stage, identity versus role confusion. And at this stage, we can see that our interaction with our peers is our critical relationship at this stage, ages 12 to 20 years old. And what we have developed now during adolescence is an identity that encompasses our family morals, the choices that we've made along the way so far, and our belief in our competences. And then we develop a loyalty towards those others who have similar qualities as we do. When we don't feel like we fit in the way that we should, when we don't find other peers who believe the same ways that we do or have the same values that we do, if we grew up, for example, in a household that's maladaptive, then what we end up doing is having role confusion. And role confusion is an outcome of not having those peers that I can really identify with. Now, I just want to take a real small break here in our conversation about this hierarchy to demonstrate what ends up happening relative to not successfully overcoming one of those conflicts at one of those stages. What we see in therapy and in adult relationships is that when a trauma occurs, very often we end up exhibiting behaviors in that age bracket. In psychological terms or therapy terms, what we call that are, we experience triggers. What are triggers? Triggers are $500 reactions to $5 problems. And so we see individuals engaging in these triggers when they engage in dysfunctional or maladaptive behaviors. And depending on the types of behaviors that people engage in when they're triggered can help us determine what age or what stage that individual experienced the trauma in their lives. So, If an individual gets triggered and their behaviors are aggressive and cussing and swearing at you and being belligerent, well, those are behaviors that we typically see of male young adults, right? Or adolescents, somewhere around there, where real highly aggressive defensive behaviors. So that individual may have had problems with identity versus role confusion, or maybe even finding a significant other, which we haven't gotten to that stage yet. Okay. However, I may see certain behaviors where an individual is triggered and they have a temper tantrum. In fact, I see that quite often where individuals are acting like children, not even adolescents, not even teenagers, but more like older children, combative children. That could mean that their traumatic event occurred when they were younger, in childhood. I've also seen individuals who have been triggered in ways where they actually literally deal with their anxiety or their conflict by getting in a fetal position. A fetal position might suggest that individuals experience traumas at very young ages. Okay, let's move on now. And so now, as we move into the first real adult stage of Erikson's psychosocial stages of development, we see that our virtue that we are trying to acquire is love, real love. So here we have intimacy versus isolation as the conflict at this age range between 20 and 30 years old. And what is the critical relationship? The critical relationship is with a significant other. So are we able to develop a loving relationship? Again, our ability to develop a loving relationship is dependent upon our success in each one of the prior stages of development. At each stage of the conflict, were we successful? Now, you can see that many of us still go ahead and get married, right? That many of us still go ahead and build families and have children. But the idea here is are they healthy relationships again? And we know that they can be healthy relationships if I am healthy and develop a significant relationship and virtue at each one of these stages. Moving on, at stage 30 to 65, what are we doing? During that period in our lives, we are becoming professionals typically, right? So our interaction, our critical interaction is typically with individuals at the workplace. And the virtue is that we end up caring about individuals beyond ourselves. And then the last stage is integrity versus despair. Beyond the age of 65, what are we doing? We're looking back across our lives to determine whether or not we feel like we've had a successful life. And imagine if you get to that stage and feel that you have not made the right choices, that you did not have great relationships with either your parents or your peers, that you really were dysfunctional at work and did not create a cooperative atmosphere. Wouldn't you feel great despair at that time? What I'm trying to do in these series that I'm talking about love is I'm trying to get us to build a solid foundation for love, which requires a strong family unit. Now, again, just like love and attachment, what happens if we don't have this family unit? Well, nobody says that the family unit has to be a traditional family unit, but we do see that it's critical that we have people who are loving us in unconditional ways early on in our lives. If you're concerned that you developed a insecure relationship, see my episode number 2 when we talk about adult attachments and what you should do if during your childhood you were not successful in overcoming those conflicts. This gives you another layer to take a look at. Remember that none of this is a sentence for how your life has to turn out. That's the reason why we have things like positive psychology, because I know that there are certain things that are written in my DNA. I know that there are certain environmental events that help determine who I am. But the fact that I can gain knowledge about these events in my life and then make choices along the way to heal myself of those broken conflicts, of those opportunities where I didn't get the virtue on board or the value on board, we can still take wonderful opportunities to help make different choices along the way so that we have healthy outcomes. Okay, now there's going to be a part 2 to this. So join me for episode number 4, which is going to be part 2, answering the question, what is love and what are differences today? So join me then on July 11th, Sunday at 4 p.m. so that we will take a second look at some of the differences between the way that we define love today and the way that we used to define love or think about love maybe 20 or 30 years ago. Okay, so now if you recall, I said that I'm always going to have a question. And here's my question for President Joe Biden. And also, I'd love Dr. Jill Biden to chime in as well, because what this is about is I want to ask you a question about our educational system. I look at some of these events, even this event of COVID, as an opportunity for all kinds of possibilities. And one opportunity that I believe that we have is an opportunity to take a look at education in a different way. I'm a special lecturer actually at a university here in Metro Detroit area. This pandemic, I've been forced to teach my courses online. And so in the fall, I'll finally get back to face-to-face. I haven't been in face-to-face classes for over a year. And so what I had to do is I had to really rethink my online courses. I preferred teaching face-to-face because I think that there's something about getting nonverbal cues from both a student and the student from me that really is a valuable interaction that we don't get when we're online with one another. Nevertheless, we still had great opportunities for learning differently. And I, for one, changed and revamped my online classes, and I ended up really getting a real positive reaction from my students. So, again, we can look at some of these things and frame some of these events in our lives as opportunities for lessons or obstacles that we can't overcome. We're going to have some conversations on those topics, including things like grit, a little bit later on. Okay, so what I want to ask you, President Joe Biden, is this is my idea for revamping education. We are getting all kinds of conflict. We are getting all kinds of uprisings from individuals who want to teach specific things, and we are getting away from some of this critical education that we need. So, learning of reading, writing, and we also have to learn about other things like culture as well. We have an opportunity to come and visit other people's cultures in our classroom right now, right? On July 4th. So we need to be taking advantage of that. We need to revamp education completely. I would like to know actually what happened to my Crisis in Science video that I had on my LinkedIn. We want people to trust scientists. Then what we need to do is we need an opportunity to answer all those questions in a uniform kind of way so that we can say, yes, Americans, yes, our children in the United States have a wonderful education. And we know this because all children are getting these basics through what I would like to call a national education system. Now, we called it public education. We're going to change it a little bit now. So, President Joe Biden, this is what I would like to ask you. I would like to ask if you would like a national teacher, and I'm volunteering to be a national teacher. Now, this is where Dr. Jill Biden comes in as well. I know that you likely have the skills to be that national teacher. Maybe we can get on board together and get President Biden to take a look at this. What this would include, in my mind, is exactly this: a teacher who gets online every single day for a certain period of time that teaches all kinds of important lessons that we need. Important lessons that are not politically motivated, but simply only educationally motivated. And we would be talking about some of these concepts that I'm talking about with you right now, because they are important developmental concepts as well. So, President Biden, I would like to ask you, would you consider a national teacher? Would you consider revamping the educational system in ways that we can reach all individuals utilizing the technology and knowledge we've acquired because we've been isolated, because of this pandemic, or for 100 other reasons that we need to have a critical look at our education system? And what I am advocating for is a national teacher that goes online and talks about critical issues and answers important questions. Okay, please look for me on YouTube under Dr. Annette Farovich, and make sure that you subscribe to my YouTube videos so you can always be alerted and aware of when I'm online live and when I've posted a new video for you. I know it's been getting noisy here. I hope it's not too noisy for you, and I hope that you enjoyed this special July 4th presentation that has been pre-recorded. Make sure that you look for me on the internet at www.healthymindbodyspirit.net, where you will be able to get all of my latest videos, or again, look for me on YouTube. Next week, we will be having our next episode, part number 2, in our series, Love and Sex in the 21st Century. And our next episode will be part 2, What is Love and What is Different Today?